The winter of 1891 arrived early in the Wyoming Territory, bringing with it a fury that even the oldest settlers hadn't seen in decades. Snow fell in thick, relentless sheets across the valley, transforming the familiar landscape into an alien world of white and shadow. The wind howled through the mountain passes like a wounded animal, carrying with it the promise of more suffering to come. Caleb Morrison stood at the frosted window of his ranch house, watching the storm gather strength. At 34, he had the weathered look of a man who'd lived twice that long. His dark hair, streaked prematurely with gray, hung past his collar. He hadn't bothered with a proper haircut since Martha died. That had been 4 years ago now. 4 years since the fire that took everything that mattered and left him with nothing but this ranch and the ghosts that haunted it. The small homestead sat isolated in the valley, a good 15 miles from the nearest town, just the way Caleb preferred it. The fewer people he had to deal with, the better. His nearest neighbor, old Samuel Briggs, lived 8 miles east, and even that felt too close sometimes. The ranch wasn't much to look at. A modest 2-room cabin, a barn that leaned slightly to the west, and a handful of outbuildings scattered about like afterthoughts. But it was his, and it was far enough from the world to keep the memories at bay, most days. Anyway, he was about to turn from the window when something caught his eye, a dark shape moving against the white, too small to be an elk, too upright to be a wolf. Caleb squinted, pressing closer to the glass. The figure stumbled, fell, struggled to rise again. His jaw tightened, probably some fool traveler who'd gotten caught in the storm. Not his problem. But as he watched, the figure collapsed again and didn't get up. Caleb cursed under his breath. He could leave whoever it was to freeze. God knew he owed the world nothing. But Martha's voice echoed in his mind, gentle and reproving, the way she'd always sounded when he'd been too harsh or too quick to judge. With another curse, he grabbed his heavy coat and hat from the peg by the door. The cold hit him like a physical blow the moment he stepped outside. The wind drove ice crystals into his face, and the snow was already knee-deep in places. He trudged toward where he'd seen the figure fall, his boots crunching through the frozen crust. The shape was smaller than he'd expected. A woman, he realized with surprise, though it was hard to tell much through the snow-crusted bundle of rags she wore. She was unconscious but still breathing, her lips blue with cold. Caleb didn't waste time with questions. He scooped her up. Lord, she weighed next to nothing, and carried her back to the house. She stirred slightly in his arms, but didn't wake. Inside, he laid her on the bed near the fireplace, the only bed in the house since he'd taken to sleeping in a chair by the stove. Her clothes were soaked through and stiff with ice. After a moment's hesitation, he peeled off the worst of the outer layers, leaving her in a thin dress that had seen better days. Her feet were in bad shape. The shoes she wore were little more than scraps of leather held together with twine. Caleb built up the fire until it roared, then heated water for tea. He wrapped her in every blanket he owned and placed warming stones at her feet. As he worked, he got his first good look at her face. Young, maybe 20, 22 at most. Pretty, too, under the grime and exhaustion. Dark hair that might be brown or auburn when it was clean. A small scar on her left cheek, old and faded. She came to slowly, eyes fluttering open to reveal a startling shade of green. For a moment she lay still, clearly trying to make sense of her surroundings. Then panic seized her. She jerked upright, scrambling backward until she hit the wall. "Stay back!" Her voice was hoarse, barely above a whisper. I won't let you." "Easy," Caleb said, keeping his distance. "You're safe. Found you in the snow." Her eyes darted around the room, taking in the modest furnishings, the rifle mounted above the fireplace, the door, planning an escape route. He realized, whatever had driven her out into that storm, it had taught her to fear enclosed spaces with strange men. "Where am I?" she asked, still pressed against the wall. "Morrison Ranch, about 15 miles west of Bitter Creek." He poured tea into a tin cup, set it on the table between them. "You need to drink something warm." She didn't move. Are you alone here?" "Yes. If anything, that seemed to increase her fear. Caleb sighed and sat down in his chair by the stove, making himself as non-threatening as possible. "Look, miss, I don't know what you're running from, and frankly, I don't care. But you are dying out there. I brought you in, warmed you up. Come morning, if the storm breaks, I'll take you to town. That's all." She studied him for a long moment, then slowly reached for the tea. Her hands shook so badly she had to use both to hold the cup. "Thank you," she whispered. "What's your name?" Another hesitation. Josephine Harper. Caleb Morrison." He nodded toward a pot on the stove. "There's stew if you're hungry. Nothing fancy. She swallowed hard. "I haven't eaten in 2 days." He fetched a bowl without comment, though inwardly he wondered what could drive someone to travel in this weather without food. When he handed it to her, she fell on it like a starving animal, then caught herself, flushing with embarrassment. "Sorry, I'm not usually—" "Eat," he said gruffly. "There's plenty." While she ate, he busied himself with checking the windows and door, making sure the storm hadn't damaged anything. The wind was picking up, rattling the shutters. It would be a long night. "You live here alone?" Josephine asked finally, the food and warmth having restored some color to her cheeks. "Yes." "For how long?" He didn't answer immediately. 4 years, give or take." She seemed to sense the weight behind those words and didn't press further. Instead, she said, "I was supposed to be married. I answered an advertisement, a rancher in Cheyenne looking for a wife." Her laugh was bitter. "Mail order bride, that's what they call it." Caleb said nothing, but he listened. He seemed nice in his letters, respectable, said he had a good spread, needed a woman's touch to make it a home. She stared into her empty bowl. "He lied about everything. The ranch was a hovel. He was cruel. When I tried to leave, She touched her cheek, and Caleb understood the scar hadn't always been old and faded. "You ran. 3 days ago." He was drunk. "I took what money I could find and ran. Made it to Bitter Creek, but he'd sent word ahead. No one would help me, so I kept walking." She looked up at him then, and he saw steel beneath the fear. "I'd rather freeze to death than go back." The fire crackled in the silence that followed. Outside, the storm raged on. Caleb found himself thinking of Martha again. How young she'd been when they'd married. How trusting. The world was hard on women alone. Harder still on those without protection or means. "Well," he said finally, "you won't freeze tonight. Get some rest. We'll sort out the rest in the morning." Josephine's eyes filled with tears. She quickly blinked away. "Why are you helping me?" He shrugged. "Storm's bad. Even I'm not heartless enough to leave someone to die in it." But as he settled into his chair for the night, pulling his coat around him like a blanket, Caleb wondered if that was the whole truth. Something about this young woman reminded him of things he'd tried very hard to forget. Hope, perhaps, or the person he'd been before grief had hollowed him out. The storm continued through the night, and he dozed fitfully, waking periodically to tend the fire. Each time, he noticed Josephine watching him from the bed, alert despite her exhaustion. Trust would not come easily to either of them. He realized they were both too well acquainted with how quickly safety could turn to ashes. As dawn approached, the wind finally began to die down, though snow still fell steadily. Soon he would have to make good on his promise to take her to town, but looking at her sleeping form, finally succumbed to exhaustion, and thinking of what awaited her there. Caleb found himself hoping the storm might last just a little longer. The storm showed no signs of letting up by evening. If anything, it had grown worse, the wind howling like a pack of wolves around the cabin's corners. Caleb had ventured out twice to check on the animals, returning each time covered in snow and ice. The temperature had dropped so low that frost formed on the inside of the windows despite the roaring fire. Josephine had spent most of the day huddled near the hearth, watching him work. She'd offered to help, but he'd waved her off. She was still weak, and her feet were in no condition for walking. Now, as darkness fell, they faced their first real meal together. Caleb set 2 plates on the rough wooden table. Nothing fancy, beans and salt pork, day-old biscuits he'd warmed by the fire, and strong black coffee. He was used to eating alone, standing by the stove or sitting on the porch steps. Sitting across from another person felt strange, like wearing clothes that no longer fit. "Thank you," Josephine said softly, picking up her fork. She ate slowly, with the careful manners of someone raised to be proper despite her current circumstances. They ate in silence for several minutes before she spoke again. "Have you always lived out here? In Wyoming, I mean?" "No, came out from Missouri about 10 years ago. Thought I'd find something better." He didn't elaborate, and she didn't push. "I'm from Ohio originally," she offered. "A little town called Millfield. You probably never heard of it." "Can't say I have." "Just as well. Nothing there worth remembering." She traced a pattern on the table with her finger. "My parents died when I was 7. Fever took them both within a week. The church sent me to the Methodist Children's Home in Cincinnati." Caleb looked up from his plate. There was no self-pity in her voice, just a matter-of-fact recounting of history. He recognized that tone. It was how he talked about his own losses when forced to. "They taught us to read and write, how to sew and cook and keep house. Everything a girl needs to be useful." A bitter smile touched her lips. "They said we were lucky. Some of the girls who aged out found positions as housemaids or shop girls. Others," she shrugged, "others answered advertisements from lonely men out west." "How old are you?" The question came out before he could stop it. 21 last September." She met his eyes. "Old enough to know better. Young enough to still hope for something more." After supper, Caleb busied himself with repairs while Josephine insisted on washing the dishes despite his protests. He sat by the fire, working on a broken bridle, stealing glances as she moved about the kitchen area. She'd pinned her hair up, and in the lamplight, he could see it was indeed auburn, with hints of gold. When she reached for a high shelf, he noticed how thin she was, her dress hanging loose on her frame. "You mentioned you've been here 4 years," she said, settling into the other chair with some mending she'd found. "Were you always alone?" His hand stilled on the leather. "No." She waited, not pressing but not changing the subject either. "Finally," he said. "Had a wife, Martha. We'd been married 6 years when I lost her. I'm sorry. House fire. I was in town when it happened. By the time I got back," he shook his head, "nothing left but ashes and regrets." Was she from Missouri too? Despite himself, a small smile tugged at his mouth. "Boston. Can you imagine? Proper Boston lady, married to a roughneck like me. Her father about had a fit when she told him. But Martha, she had a stubborn streak wider than the Mississippi." "How did you meet?" He found himself telling her how Martha's family had come to Independence looking for investment opportunities, how he'd been working at the hotel where they stayed, how she'd asked him to show her the town and somehow never stopped asking questions. Smart as a whip, curious about everything, completely unimpressed by her father's money or his threats. "She sounds wonderful," Josephine said softly. "She was." He returned to his work. "Too good for this hard life. I should have known better than to bring her out here." "You can't think like that." "Can I?" His voice turned harsh. "I promised to take care of her, give her a good life. Instead, I got her killed." Josephine set down her mending. "My parents didn't plan to die and leave me an orphan. That family in Cheyenne, the Brennans, they didn't plan for their boy to be cruel. Sometimes terrible things just happen, and all we can do is survive them." They lapsed into silence. But it was less uncomfortable than before. The fire crackled and popped, sending shadows dancing across the walls. Outside, the storm continued its assault on the world. "Tell me about the orphanage," Caleb said eventually, surprising himself. What was it like? So she told him, about the long dormitory rooms with their narrow beds, the scratchy wool uniforms, the bells that governed every moment of their days, about Sister Catherine, who smuggled them penny candy when the director wasn't looking, and Sister Agnes, who believed the rod was the only way to save their souls. About the other girls, some who cried themselves to sleep every night, others who learned to be hard as stone. There was one girl, Rebecca, who used to tell us stories at night, Josephine said, her eyes distant with memory. Made-up tales about princesses and dragons, or sometimes about ordinary girls who found extraordinary lives. We'd huddle in our beds after lights out, listening to her whisper about places where orphans became queens and no one was ever cold or hungry. What happened to her? She aged out at 17. Last I heard, she was working in a factory in Pittsburgh. Josephine picked up her sewing again. I wonder sometimes if she still tells stories. As the evening wore on, they talked about smaller things, the challenges of keeping livestock in winter, the best way to preserve vegetables, whether the railroad would eventually make it to Bitter Creek, safe topics that skirted around the circumstances that had brought them together. When Josephine yawned for the third time, Caleb stood. You should rest. Take the bed again. I couldn't. You must be exhausted from sleeping in that chair. I've slept in worse places. She bit her lip, clearly wrestling with something. Then, in a rush, she said, The bed's large enough for two. We could... That is, if you stayed on your side and I stayed on mine. He stared at her, and she flushed crimson. I'm sorry. That was improper. I just thought, it's so cold, and you've been kind, and I trust... She trailed off, looking miserable. You shouldn't trust so easily, he said gruffly. Perhaps not, but I've learned to read men pretty well these past few years. The cruel ones have a look about them, something in the eyes, the way they hold themselves. You're not cruel. Caleb Morrison, wounded, maybe, angry at the world. Certainly, but not cruel. He didn't know what to say to that, so he said nothing. Instead, he banked the fire and blew out all but one lamp. When he turned, she was already beneath the covers, pressed against the far wall. After a long moment, he sat on the edge of the bed and pulled off his boots. Just for warmth, he said, lying down atop the blankets, still fully clothed. Just for warmth, she agreed. But in the darkness, with the storm raging outside and the unfamiliar sound of another person breathing nearby, Caleb felt something shift inside his chest. It had been so long since he'd shared space with another soul, since he'd allowed himself even this small comfort. He stayed rigid, afraid to move, afraid to acknowledge how good it felt not to be alone, somewhere in the night. Josephine's hand found his across the blankets. Her fingers were small and cold, and without thinking, he wrapped them in his own. They lay there, connected by that single point of contact. While the wind howled and the snow piled higher against the windows, neither of them spoke. There was nothing to say that wouldn't break whatever fragile understanding had grown between them. But when sleep finally came, it was deeper and more peaceful than either had known in years. The morning would bring decisions and difficulties. The storm would end, and the world would intrude with all its harsh realities. But for now, in the darkness and the cold, two broken people found a moment's warmth in each other's company. It wasn't love. Not yet. It wasn't even desire. Exactly. It was simply the recognition that they were both human, both hurting, and neither had to bear it alone tonight. Outside, the storm began to show the first signs of weakening, though neither of them noticed. They were already lost to sleep, hands still entwined, while the fire burned low and the cabin creaked under its burden of snow. The morning sun broke through the clouds for the first time in 3 days, casting long shadows across the snow-covered valley. Caleb stood at the window, watching the light transform the landscape from hostile white to something almost beautiful. Behind him, he could hear Josephine moving about, folding the blankets with careful precision. Storm's breaking, he said without turning. Should be able to make it to town by noon. Yes, she said quietly. I suppose we should. Neither of them moved. The moment stretched between them, fragile as spun glass. Last night had changed something, though neither could name what. The simple act of sleeping side by side, of holding hands in the darkness, had created a connection that daylight threatened to shatter. Caleb cleared his throat. "I'll see to the horses." He was halfway to the door when the sound of approaching riders stopped him cold. Through the frosted window, he could make out 3 figures on horseback, picking their way through the snowdrifts. His hand moved instinctively toward the rifle. "Someone's coming," he said. Josephine went rigid, the color draining from her face. "Is it? Can you see who?" The riders drew closer, and Caleb recognized the lead man, Reverend Michael Hartley from Bitter Creek, his black coat stark against the white landscape. With him rode Sheriff Ben Watson and another man Caleb didn't know, a thin fellow with the pinched look of a bureaucrat. "It's the Reverend," Caleb said, frowning. "And the sheriff." "Oh, God," Josephine whispered. "They've come for me. He must have sent word, offered a reward." "Easy." Caleb grabbed his coat. "Let me handle this." He stepped out onto the porch as the riders pulled up. Reverend Hartley, a man in his 50s with steel-gray hair and a face that had seen too much of human nature's darker side, tipped his hat. "Caleb, good to see you weathered the storm." "Reverend." Caleb nodded to the others. "Sheriff, gentlemen, what brings you all the way out here?" The thin man spoke up, his voice nasal and officious. "I'm Harold Pemberton, represent the Territorial Authority. We've had some concerning reports." "Reports?" Sheriff Watson, a decent man who'd always treated Caleb fairly, looked uncomfortable. "Some folks passing through yesterday said they saw you carrying a woman into your place. Said she looked to be in distress." "Found someone caught in the storm," Caleb said evenly. "Would you have had me leave her to freeze?" "Of course not," Reverend Hartley said quickly. "The Lord commands us to show mercy. But Caleb, you must understand how this looks. A young woman, unchaperoned, spending multiple nights in the home of an unmarried man." "Nothing improper happened," Caleb said, his voice hardening. Pemberton sniffed. "That's hardly the point. The appearance of impropriety is damaging enough. The Territorial Authority has been quite clear about maintaining moral standards in our communities." The door opened behind him, and Josephine stepped out. She'd tidied herself as best she could, but there was no hiding the fact that she'd been living rough. The men's eyes fixed on her with varying degrees of interest and judgment. "Miss," Reverend Hartley said gently, "are you all right? Has this man, Mr. Morrison, saved my life?" Josephine interrupted, lifting her chin. "I was lost in the storm, and he showed Christian charity by taking me in." "And your name?" "Miss?" Pemberton had produced a small notebook. "Josephine Harper." The sheriff leaned forward in his saddle. "Would you be the same Miss Harper who was contracted to marry William Brennan over in Cheyenne?" Josephine's composure cracked slightly. Yes, but..." "Mr. Brennan sent word you'd stolen from him and broken your contract. Said to watch for a woman of your description." "He's a liar and a brute," Josephine said fiercely. "I took nothing but what was mine. That's a matter for the courts." Pemberton said, "What concerns us now is the current situation. Miss Harper, you've spent 2 nights under this man's roof." "3, Caleb said flatly. "Storm lasted 3 days." Pemberton's eyes gleamed with satisfaction. 3 nights, I see. And you claim nothing improper occurred?" "I don't claim anything," Caleb said. "I'm telling you what happened." "The problem," Reverend Hartley said, his voice heavy with regret, "is that it doesn't matter what did or didn't happen. The damage to Miss Harper's reputation is done. No decent family will take her in now. No respectable establishment will hire her." "That's not..." Josephine began, but the sheriff cut her off. "There's also the matter of Mr. Brennan's complaint. He's demanding she be returned to fulfill her contract." "Like hell," Caleb growled. "Or," Pemberton said smoothly, "there's another option, one that would solve everyone's problems." Caleb knew what was coming before the man said it. He'd seen this play out before in frontier towns, the forced respectability. The shotgun weddings that preserved everyone's dignity but the couple involved. Marriage, Reverend Hartley said. It's the only way to salvage the situation. Caleb, you're a respected man, a landowner. If you were to marry Miss Harper, it would silence the gossips and give her the protection of your name, Mr. Brennan could hardly pursue a married woman. And if I refuse, Sheriff Watson shifted uncomfortably. Then I'll have to take Miss Harper back to face charges. And Caleb, there might be questions about your conduct as well. The territorial authorities been looking to make examples lately. You mean they'd trump up charges against me? No one wants that. The Reverend said quickly. This is about doing what's right, about protecting a young woman's future. Caleb looked at Josephine. She stood very still, her face pale but composed. Only her hands, clenched so tight her knuckles were white, betrayed her fear. He thought about the story she'd told him, about the orphanage and the dreams of something better. He thought about William Brennan and what awaited her if she was sent back. What does Miss Harper say about this? He asked. All eyes turned to her. She met Caleb's gaze, and in that moment, something passed between them. An understanding, perhaps, or a resignation to the strange hands fate had dealt them. She swallowed hard. I would be honored to accept Mr. Morrison's protection if he's willing to offer it. Josephine, Caleb said quietly. You don't have to. She stepped closer to him, close enough that only he could hear her whisper. Please, I know it's not fair to you, but please. Her hand brushed his, just barely, and he was reminded of last night, the warmth of her fingers in the darkness, the peace of not being alone. He'd spent 4 years building walls around himself, 4 years nursing his grief and guilt. Now this slip of a girl was asking him to tear them all down. Fine, he said roughly. We'll marry. Reverend Hartley's relief was palpable. Excellent. The Lord works in mysterious ways. We can perform the ceremony right now. I brought my Bible, anticipating this might be necessary. Now? Josephine's voice was faint. Best to have things settled immediately. Pemberton said, for all concerned. And so, in the snow-covered yard of a ranch 15 miles from nowhere, Caleb Morrison found himself getting married for the second time in his life. There were no flowers, no music, no guests save for a sheriff and a territorial bureaucrat. Josephine wore the same worn dress she'd arrived in. Caleb hadn't even shaved. Reverend Hartley spoke the familiar words while the wind picked up again, sending snow swirling around them. When he asked if anyone objected, only the mountains answered with their silence. Caleb slipped his mother's ring, the one he'd retrieved from the ashes of the fire, onto Josephine's finger. It was too large, and she had to close her fist to keep it from falling off. You may kiss your bride, the Reverend said. Caleb hesitated, then leaned down and pressed his lips briefly to Josephine's forehead. She shivered, though whether from cold or something else, he couldn't tell. Congratulations, Sheriff Watson said, though he didn't look particularly happy. Mrs. Morrison, I'll send word to Cheyenne that the matter is settled. The men mounted their horses and rode away, leaving the newlyweds standing in the snow, when they were just dots on the horizon. Josephine swayed on her feet. Caleb caught her arm. I'm sorry, she whispered. I'm so sorry. I've trapped you. No one trapped me, he said gruffly. I made my choice. Question is, what do we do now? She looked up at him, and he was struck again by those green eyes, now bright with unshed tears. I don't know. I've never been married before. Despite everything. Caleb felt his mouth twitch. Well, I have. And I can tell you this much. It usually starts with going inside where it's warm. She managed a wan smile. That sounds like good advice. They walked back to the cabin, his cabin, their cabin now, and closed the door against the cold. Inside, nothing had changed. The same rough furniture, the same single bed, the same ghosts lurking in the corners. But everything was different now. They were bound together, two strangers playing at being husband and wife. Caleb, Josephine stood by the fire, twisting the too large ring on her finger. What happened last night? I mean, now that should we? Nothing has to happen, he said quickly. This is a legal arrangement, nothing more. You needed protection. I provided it. You'll have a roof over your head, food to eat, safety from men like Brennan. That's all. Relief and something else, disappointment, flickered across her face. Of course, thank you for understanding. But as the day wore on and night approached again, they both felt the weight of what they'd done. They were married now, in the eyes of God and the law. They ate dinner in awkward silence, performed their evening chores like actors who'd forgotten their lines, and when darkness fell, they stood on opposite sides of the bedroom, neither knowing quite what to do. I can sleep by the stove again, Caleb offered. No, Josephine said softly. It's your bed, your home. We're married now. We should at least try to make it work. And so they found themselves back where they'd been the night before, lying side by side in the darkness. But everything had changed. The innocent comfort of two strangers sharing warmth had been replaced by the complicated reality of husband and wife. Caleb? Josephine whispered. Yeah, thank you, for everything. He didn't answer, but after a moment, his hand found hers again in the darkness. This time, when their fingers entwined, it meant something more. A promise, perhaps, or just two people holding on to each other in a world that seemed determined to tear everything apart. Outside, fresh snow began to fall, covering the tracks of the men who'd changed their lives forever. Inside, Caleb Morrison and his unexpected bride lay awake, each lost in their own thoughts, wondering what strange fate had brought them together and what tomorrow would bring. 2 weeks into their unexpected marriage, a fragile routine had developed at the Morrison Ranch. Josephine rose before dawn to start the fire and prepare breakfast. While Caleb tended to the animals, they worked separately through the day, him repairing fences and checking trap lines, her attacking the years of neglect inside the cabin with determined energy. Evenings found them sharing quiet meals, the silence between them less awkward now, though still careful. Josephine had proved herself more capable than Caleb expected. She'd taken one look at his makeshift repairs and clucked her tongue in disapproval, then set about making proper fixes. She'd reorganized the pantry, mended every piece of clothing he owned, and somehow made the sparse cabin feel less like a cave and more like a home. You should teach me about the animals, she said one morning, watching him pull on his boots. If I'm to be a rancher's wife, I ought to know these things. He glanced at her, surprised. It's hard work, not exactly suitable for a woman? She raised an eyebrow. Caleb Morrison. I've scrubbed floors until my hands bled and hauled water for 30 girls at the orphanage. I think I can manage a few cows. So he taught her how to milk their 2 dairy cows without getting kicked, how to scatter feed for the chickens and collect eggs without disturbing the temperamental rooster, how to tell when a horse was favoring a leg or when the sheep were restless from predators nearby. She was a quick study, asking questions that showed she was truly listening. You're different than I expected, he admitted one afternoon as they worked side by side repairing the chicken coop. How so? Tougher. Most women would be complaining about the cold, the isolation, the work. She handed him another nail. Most women haven't lived the life I have. This is paradise compared to some places I've been. But paradise had its shadows. The nearest neighbors, the Briggs family, had made their opinions clear when they'd ridden by the week before. Mrs. Briggs had looked at Josephine like she was something scraped off a boot heel, and her parting words still stung. Mail-order bride, indeed. We all know what that really means. Josephine had held her head high until they were out of sight, then excused herself to the barn where Caleb found her 20 minutes later, crying into a horse's mane. Don't let them get to you, he'd said awkwardly. I'm not crying for me, she'd replied. I'm crying for you. You were respected here. Now they look at you like you've lost your mind, taking in some fallen woman. I don't give a damn what they think. You should. This is your home, your reputation. My reputation died in a fire 4 years ago, he'd said harshly. Let them talk. Now, as they worked on the coop, he watched her from the corner of his eye. The sun had brought out golden highlights in her hair, and her cheeks had gained color from the outdoor work. She'd filled out some too, no longer looking like a strong wind might blow her away. When she laughed at the rooster's attempts to intimidate her, something twisted in his chest. Josephine, he began, then stopped. She looked at him expectantly. Town trip tomorrow. Need supplies before the next storm hits. You should come. Her face shuddered. I don't think that's wise. People will stare. Let them. You're Mrs. Morrison now. That means something in this territory. Whatever the circumstances. She studied him for a long moment. All right, but if someone says something cruel, they won't. Not to your face. Anyway, Ben Watson's a good sheriff, and most folks respect the law even if they don't respect us. The next morning dawned clear and cold. Josephine emerged from the bedroom wearing her best dress, which wasn't saying much, with her hair pinned up properly. She'd done something with an old piece of lace to make a collar, and Caleb was struck by how young she looked, how determined to face the world with dignity. The ride to town was quiet, but companionable. Josephine sat beside him on the wagon bench, their shoulders occasionally touching when the wheels hit ruts. She asked about the landmarks they passed, and he found himself telling stories he hadn't thought about in years. The time he and Martha had gotten lost in a snowstorm near that stand of pines. The spring where he'd shot his first elk. Bitter Creek was bustling for a small frontier town. The general store, Watson's Dry Goods, stood at the center of the main street, flanked by the saloon, the church, and various other establishments. People turned to stare as their wagon rolled past, and Caleb felt Josephine tense beside him. Steady, he murmured. Remember, you belong here now. At the store, Mr. Watson, the sheriff's brother, greeted them with professional courtesy. His wife was less subtle, eyeing Josephine with barely concealed curiosity. Other women in the store whispered behind their hands, their eyes following the young Mrs. Morrison as she moved through the aisles. Josephine kept her composure, selecting flour and sugar and coffee with careful consideration. But when they reached the fabric section, she paused, running her fingers over a bolt of dark blue wool. See something you like? Caleb asked. It's beautiful, she said wistfully. But we don't need... How much for 5 yards? Caleb asked Mr. Watson. Caleb, no, it's too expensive. You need a proper dress. Can't have my wife going around in rags. The word wife still felt strange on his tongue, but he was rewarded by the way her face lit up. They were loading their purchases when trouble arrived in the form of Samuel Briggs and his son, Thomas. The elder Briggs had been drinking. Caleb could smell it from 10 feet away. Well, Morrison and his bride. The way Briggs said the last word made it sound dirty. Heard you had quite the courtship. 3 whole days. Samuel, Caleb said evenly. Best move along. Just being neighborly. Briggs swayed slightly. Wanted to get a look at the woman who finally thawed out old Caleb. Must be something special under those skirts. He didn't get to finish. Caleb's fist connected with his jaw, sending him sprawling in the muddy street. Thomas stepped forward, but stopped when he saw Caleb's expression. You speak to my wife with respect, or you don't speak to her at all, Caleb said quietly. That goes for all of you. He raised his voice, addressing the gathered crowd. I know what you're all thinking. I know what you're saying behind closed doors. But Josephine is my wife, legal and proper, and anyone who treats her otherwise will answer to me. Sheriff Watson appeared, drawn by the commotion. Problem here? No problem, Caleb said, helping Josephine onto the wagon. Just clarifying some things. As they drove out of town, Josephine sat in stunned silence. Finally, she said, you didn't have to do that. Yes, I did. You could have been hurt or arrested. Worth it. She touched his arm lightly. Caleb, thank you. That night, She made a special dinner with their fresh supplies, nothing fancy. But she'd tried harder than usual. They ate by lamplight. And for the first time, the silence felt comfortable rather than strained. "I've been thinking," she said as she cleared the plates, "about what you said, about Martha." He stiffened. "What about her? You blame yourself for her death, but from what you've told me, she chose to come west with you. She chose this life because she loved you." Josephine sat back down, meeting his eyes. "Don't dishonor her memory by thinking she'd want you to be alone forever. You don't understand. I understand guilt," she said quietly. "I understand thinking you should have done something different, been someone different. But Caleb, punishing yourself won't bring her back." He stood abruptly, the chair scraping against the floor. "I need to check the animals." But when he returned an hour later, she was sitting by the fire, working on cutting out pattern pieces from the blue fabric. She looked up at him, and something in her expression made him stop. "I'm not trying to replace her," Josephine said softly. "I know you didn't want another wife, but I am your wife now, for better or worse, and I'd like to make this work, if you'll let me." Caleb stood in the doorway, torn between the safety of his grief and the dangerous warmth of hope. Finally, he crossed the room and sat in the chair beside her. "Show me what you're making," he said gruffly. She smiled, a real smile that reached her eyes, and began explaining her plans for the dress. As she talked, animated and pleased, Caleb felt something shift inside him. Not healing, exactly. That would take more time than they'd had, but maybe, just maybe, the first crack in the wall he'd built around his heart. Outside, snow began to fall again, but inside the cabin was warm with lamplight and the quiet companionship of two people slowly learning to trust. It wasn't love yet, but it was something. And for now, something was enough. The spring thaw had begun early that year, turning the roads to mud and swelling the creeks with snowmelt. Josephine stood at the kitchen window, watching Caleb work on expanding the vegetable garden. 3 months of marriage had brought changes to both of them. He smiled more often now, and she had lost that haunted look that spoke of too many nights spent running. She was kneading bread when she heard the horses, multiple riders, coming fast. Her hands stilled as memories flooded back, the sound of William Brennan's voice, the fear that had driven her into a blizzard. Through the window, she saw Caleb straighten, his hand moving to the rifle propped against the fence post. 4 men rode into the yard, and Josephine's heart sank as she recognized the lead rider. Not Brennan himself, but Jake Porter, his foreman. She'd seen him often enough at the Brennan ranch, always watching her with eyes that made her skin crawl. "Morrison," Porter called out, reining in his horse. "Need a word with you." Caleb walked toward them slowly, rifle held loose but ready. "State your business." "Got a message from Mr. Brennan. Seems there's some dispute about property that belongs to him." "Worm, if you're talking about my wife, she's not property," Caleb said coldly. Porter grinned, showing tobacco-stained teeth. "Ain't talking about the woman, though Mr. Brennan's got opinions about that too. Talking about the money she stole. $300, he says. Wants it back, with interest." Josephine stepped out onto the porch. "I took $20 that was owed to me for work done. Nothing more." "That's not how Mr. Brennan sees it." Porter's eyes raked over her. My, don't you clean up nice? Almost worth the trouble you've caused." "Watch your mouth," Caleb warned. "Or what, you gonna take on all 4 of us?" Porter leaned forward in his saddle. "Here's the deal. Morrison, pay what she owes, or we'll take it out in trade. Maybe that pretty little wife of yours could work off the debt. I'm sure we could find ways to keep her busy." The rifle was in Caleb's hands before Porter finished speaking. "Get off my land, now." "This ain't over," Porter said. "Mr. Brennan's got friends, important friends. You can't protect her forever." They wheeled their horses around and rode off, but not before one of them put a torch to the hay pile near the barn. Caleb and Josephine rushed to put out the flames before they could spread, working frantically with buckets of water from the trough. When the danger had passed, they stood in the muddy yard, breathing hard. Josephine's dress was soaked and stained with soot, her carefully pinned hair hanging in wet strings. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I've brought nothing but trouble to your door. Maybe I should—" "Should what?" Caleb turned on her, eyes blazing. "Leave? Run away again? That's your solution?" She flinched at his tone. "You don't understand what Brennan is capable of. He won't stop until—" "Until what? Until he destroys everything I have left?" Caleb threw down the bucket in frustration. "You think I care about the barn? The money? You think any of that matters?" "Then what does matter?" she shouted back, tears streaming down her face. "You!" The word hung between them in the sudden silence. Caleb ran a hand through his hair, struggling for control. "You matter. Damn it. I won't let him take you. I won't let anyone—" His voice broke. Josephine stared at him, seeing for the first time past his anger to the fear beneath, fear of loss, of failing to protect someone he'd grown to care about, without thinking. She closed the distance between them, wrapping her arms around his waist. He stood rigid for a moment. Then his arms came around her, holding her tight against his chest. She could feel his heart racing, matching her own. "I won't leave," she whispered into his shirt. "I promise, I won't leave." They stood there in the muddy yard, holding each other while smoke still drifted from the ruined hay. Finally, Caleb pulled back enough to look at her face. "We need to be ready," he said. "They'll be back, and probably with more men. I've got some money saved, enough to pay what Brennan claims you owe, but I don't trust him to leave it at that." "We could go to the sheriff," Josephine suggested. "Ben Watson's a good man, but his reach only extends so far. Brennan's got money and connections." Caleb's jaw tightened. "No, we'll handle this ourselves. But first, you need to tell me everything. No more secrets." That evening, Josephine told him the whole truth, how Brennan had seemed charming in his letters, painting a picture of a prosperous ranch and a lonely widower seeking companionship. How the reality had been so different, a run-down place worked by men who looked at her like wolves eyeing a lamb. How Brennan had expected her to be grateful for his attention, had grown violent when she refused his advances. "The money I took was from his desk," she admitted. "But it was only what he'd promised for travel expenses and never paid. He kept me there for 2 weeks, saying I owed him for room and board, that I couldn't leave until I'd worked off the debt. When I realized what kind of work he had in mind—" She shuddered. Caleb's hands clenched into fists. "I should have shot Porter when I had the chance. No, you did the right thing. Violence only breeds more violence." She covered his hands with hers. "We'll face this together, whatever comes." That night, they prepared. Caleb cleaned and loaded every weapon in the house, showed Josephine how to shoot the old Navy Colt he kept in the bedroom. She was a poor shot at first, flinching at the noise, but determination made her persist until she could hit the target more often than not. They moved the livestock closer to the house, secured what valuables they had, and waited. But days passed with no sign of Porter or his men. The waiting was almost worse than an attack would have been, keeping them both on edge, jumping at shadows. A week later, Josephine was hanging laundry when she heard horses again. This time, she recognized Sheriff Watson's distinctive gray mare. With him rode Reverend Hartley and another man she didn't know, older, well-dressed, with the bearing of authority. Mrs. Morrison. The sheriff touched his hat. "Is your husband about?" "He's in the barn. I'll fetch him." But Caleb was already emerging, drawn by the sound of visitors. "Ben," Caleb nodded. "Reverend, don't believe I know your friend." "Judge Harold Whitman, from the Territorial Court," Watson said. "He's here about the situation with William Brennan." The judge dismounted with the careful movements of a man whose bones had seen too many miles. "Mr. Morrison, Mrs. Morrison, I've been asked to mediate this dispute before it escalates further. Mr. Brennan has filed formal charges against your wife, theft, breach of contract, and moral turpitude." "That's a lie," Josephine said hotly. That's for the court to decide. Young woman. However, I'm willing to hear both sides before this goes to trial. Mr. Brennan has agreed to drop all charges in exchange for $500 and other considerations. What other considerations? Caleb's voice was dangerous. The judge looked uncomfortable. He maintains that the marriage is invalid, performed under duress. He's willing to forget the money if Mrs. Morrison returns to fulfill her original contract over my dead body. That's what I'm trying to prevent, Mr. Morrison. The judge studied them both. I've looked into this matter. Miss Harper, Mrs. Morrison, isn't the first woman to flee Brennan's employ under questionable circumstances. But he has influence, and the law regarding marriage contracts is complex. There's nothing complex about it. Reverend Hartley spoke up. I performed the ceremony myself. They are legally and spiritually bound. Perhaps, but if Brennan pursues this, it could get ugly and expensive. The judge paused. There is another option. You could leave the territory, start fresh somewhere else. This is my home, Caleb said flatly. I won't be driven off by a bully and a liar. Josephine touched his arm. Caleb, maybe we should consider— No. He turned to the judge. Tell Brennan if he wants a fight. He'll get one. But he better be prepared for what that means. I've been patient, tried to handle this peaceful-like, but if he or his men set foot on my property again, I'll defend what's mine. The judge sighed. I was afraid you'd say that. Very well, I'll relay your position. But Mr. Morrison, Mrs. Morrison, be careful. Brennan's not a man who takes defiance well. After they left, Josephine found herself shaking. He won't stop. You know he won't stop. Caleb pulled her close. Then we won't stop either. This is our home. Josephine, our life. I won't let him take it from us. That night, as they lay in bed together, Josephine turned to face him in the darkness. Caleb, what you said earlier, did you mean it, that I matter to you? He was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. Then, you know I did. Then show me, she whispered. Please, if something happens tomorrow or the next day, I don't want to die without knowing what it feels like to truly be your wife. In the darkness, she felt him turn toward her. His hand found her cheek, thumb brushing away a tear she hadn't realized had fallen. Josephine, please, she said again. His kiss was gentle at first, almost hesitant, as if he was afraid she might break, but when she responded, pressing closer, something shifted between them. The careful distance they'd maintained, the polite friendship of their marriage, fell away. In its place was need and fear and a desperate desire to affirm life in the face of threat. Afterwards, they held each other close. No longer two damaged people sharing a house, but truly husband and wife. Outside, a wolf howled in the distance, but inside they were warm and safe, at least for now. I love you, Josephine whispered against his chest. I know it's too soon. I know you might not feel the same, but I needed to say it. Caleb's arms tightened around her. He didn't say the words back, couldn't yet, maybe, but he held her like she was the most precious thing in the world, and for now, that was enough. The decision came to Josephine in the pre-dawn hours as she lay listening to Caleb's steady breathing. She couldn't keep running from her past, couldn't keep letting it poison their future. If she faced Brennan directly, perhaps she could end this before more blood was shed. She slipped from bed carefully, dressed in the darkness, and penned a brief note. I've gone to end this. Please understand. I love you. Jay. The 3-day walk to Brennan's ranch tested every ounce of her resolve. She'd taken a little food, the $20 she'd saved from selling eggs, and the old Navy Colt Caleb had taught her to use. The weight of it in her coat pocket was both comforting and terrifying. Each night she slept rough, hidden in coulees or abandoned line shacks, starting at every sound. By the time she reached the outskirts of Cheyenne, her feet were blistered and her hands raw from the cold. The Brennan spread looked even more run down than she remembered, fences sagging, buildings in need of paint, an air of neglect that spoke of a man more interested in appearances than substance. She could see why he'd wanted a wife he didn't have to pay. The saloon where Brennan spent most of his evenings was a squalid place that reeked of spilled whiskey and unwashed bodies. Josephine pulled her shawl up over her hair and entered through the back door. She found him at his usual table, playing cards with 3 other men, Jake Porter among them. Well. Brennan looked up, his piggish eyes gleaming with satisfaction. Look what crawled back, boys. You remember my bride? I'm not your bride, Josephine said steadily. I'm here to settle this once and for all. Brennan laughed, an ugly sound. Settle, girl. You owe me more than you could settle in a lifetime, but I'm willing to be generous. Come back where you belong, and we'll call it square. I have a husband. That sham marriage, Judge Whitman already told me it won't hold up in court, performed under duress, no proper courtship period. I've got lawyers who'll tear it apart. He stood, swaying slightly from drink. You're mine, bought and paid for. The sooner you accept that, the easier it'll be. Porter moved to block the door. The other men spread out, surrounding her. Josephine's hand found the pistol in her pocket, but she knew she couldn't shoot them all. I'll work, she said desperately. Not what you wanted. But I'll work as a housekeeper, cooking and cleaning, until the debt is paid. Real work, with wages set proper. Work? Brennan moved closer, and she could smell the whiskey on his breath. You'll work, all right, but not in the kitchen. He grabbed her arm, and years of fear and anger crystallized into a single moment of clarity. Josephine drew the pistol and pressed it against his substantial belly. The room went very still. Let go, she said quietly, or I'll blow a hole in you big enough to see through. Brennan's face went white, then red with rage, but he released her arm. You little... The saloon door burst open. Caleb stood there, rifle in hand, looking like death itself. Behind him was Sheriff Watson and 2 deputies. Caleb's eyes found hers, a mixture of relief and fury in their depths. Step away from my wife, he said, his voice deadly quiet. Your wife? Brennan sputtered. She pulled a gun on me. Arrest her. Sheriff Watson surveyed the scene. Seems to me she was defending herself. 4 men, 1 woman. Don't look too good. Brennan. She owes me money. Then take it to court, Watson said. But this ends now. Mrs. Morrison. Lower the weapon. Mr. Morrison. You too. Josephine's hand shook as she lowered the pistol. Caleb was at her side in 2 strides, pulling her behind him. This isn't over, Brennan snarled. Yes, it is. A new voice came from the doorway. Judge Whitman entered, followed by Reverend Hartley and several other townspeople. Mr. Brennan, I've been doing some investigating since our last meeting. Seems you've had 5 mail-order brides in the past 2 years, all of them left under mysterious circumstances. One of them, a Miss Catherine Mills, was found dead in the river. Ruled an accident at the time, but I'm thinking we should take another look. Brennan's face went ashen. You can't prove anything. Maybe not, but I can make sure every newspaper in the territory knows about it. No decent woman will come within 100 miles of you. The judge turned to Josephine. Mrs. Morrison, do you wish to press charges for assault and false imprisonment? Josephine looked at Brennan, seeing him for what he really was, a pathetic, cruel little man who fed on fear. No, I just want this to be over. Then it's over. Judge Whitman said firmly, Mr. Brennan, any further harassment of the Morrisons will result in your immediate arrest. Is that clear? Brennan nodded sullenly, his eyes never leaving Josephine's face. There was a promise in that look, but also fear. She'd stood up to him, and men like him couldn't bear that. Outside, Caleb gripped her arm tightly as they walked to where he'd left the wagon. What the hell were you thinking? He demanded, once they were away from curious ears. You could have been killed. I was thinking about you, she shot back. About us. I couldn't let you keep fighting my battles. Your battles? He stopped walking, turning her to face him. Josephine, Your battles are my battles. That's what marriage means. I know, but no buts. His hands framed her face. When I woke up and found you gone, I thought I'd lost you. I thought... His voice broke. I'm sorry, she whispered. I'm so sorry. I just wanted to protect you. Protect me? He laughed, but it sounded more like a sob. Woman, I've already lost everything once. I can survive losing the ranch, the money, even my life, but I can't survive losing you. Do you understand? I can't. The words he hadn't been able to say that night came pouring out now, raw and desperate. I love you. God help me. I fought it, but I love you. You brought me back to life. Josephine, you made me want to live again instead of just existing. So don't you ever leave me like that again. She was crying now, tears streaming down her face. I won't. I promise. I love you too. So much it scares me. He kissed her there in the muddy street, not caring who saw, when they finally broke apart. Sheriff Watson cleared his throat. Folks, might want to head home. Storm's coming in. The ride back to the ranch was quiet, but it was a different kind of silence than before. The peaceful quiet of two people who had finally found their way to each other. Josephine sat pressed against Caleb's side, his arm around her shoulders, feeling safer than she'd ever felt in her life. As they pulled into the yard, snow began to fall again, but this time it seemed like a blessing rather than a threat. They were home, they were together, and the shadow that had hung over them was finally lifting. That night, as they sat by the fire, Josephine told him everything, every detail of her time with Brennan, every fear that had driven her to run. Caleb listened without judgment, holding her when the memories became too much. It's over now, he said when she'd finished. He can't hurt you anymore. Do you really think he'll leave us alone? With Judge Whitman watching him, he'd be a fool to try anything. Caleb stroked her hair. And if he does, we'll face it together. No more running off on your own. No more, she agreed, settling deeper into his embrace. They made love that night with a tenderness born of nearly losing each other. Each touch an affirmation, each whispered word a promise. When morning came, bringing fresh snow and a world washed clean, they rose to face it together. Caleb had already started planning for spring, expanding the garden, maybe adding to the herd if prices were good. Josephine talked about putting up preserves to sell in town, maybe taking in sewing work, simple plans for a simple life. But to two people who'd known loss and loneliness, it sounded like paradise. As Josephine prepared breakfast, humming softly, Caleb watched her move about the kitchen, their kitchen, in their home. The ghost of Martha no longer haunted these rooms. She'd been laid to rest at last, her memory a gentle presence rather than a painful wound. He knew she would have liked Josephine, would have wanted him to find happiness again. What are you thinking about? Josephine asked, setting a plate in front of him. The future, he said, catching her hand and pressing a kiss to her palm. Our future. She smiled, that bright, genuine smile that transformed her whole face. I like the sound of that. Outside, the snow continued to fall, blanketing the world in pristine white. But inside the Morrison Ranch, there was warmth and love and the promise of all the years to come. They had fought for this, fought Brennan, fought the past, fought their own fears, and they had won. The young woman who'd stumbled out of a blizzard was gone, replaced by a strong, confident wife. The bitter widower who'd saved her had been transformed into a man who could love again. Together, they would build something new from the ashes of their old lives, something stronger for having been tested by fire. And if challenges came again, as challenges always did in the harsh landscape of the frontier, they would face them as they had learned to face everything, together. Spring arrived with a vengeance that year, bringing warm Chinook winds that melted the snow in days rather than weeks. The creek swelled with runoff, and the first green shoots pushed through the mud with determined optimism. Josephine stood in the doorway of the cabin, one hand pressed to her lower back, watching Caleb repair the fence line that had suffered through the winter storms. She'd suspected for weeks now, but this morning's nausea had confirmed it. The signs were unmistakable. The bone-deep tiredness, the tenderness in her body, the way certain smells made her stomach turn. She was with child. The knowledge filled her with equal parts joy and terror. Joy at the thought of new life, of giving Caleb the family he'd lost. Terror because she knew how quickly happiness could turn to ash. She'd seen too many women at the orphanage die in childbirth, seen the grief that followed when things went wrong. That evening, she prepared Caleb's favorite meal, venison stew with fresh bread and the last of the preserved berries from winter. He came in tired but satisfied, having finished not only the fence but also the frame for the chicken coop expansion they'd planned. "Smells wonderful in here," he said, washing his hands at the basin. "What's the occasion? Can't a wife cook a nice meal for her husband without reason?" He studied her, that careful way he had of seeing past her words to what lay beneath. "You've been quiet all day. Something troubling you." She served the stew, buying time, trying to find the right words. "How did you tell a man who'd already lost one family that you were carrying his child? How did you offer hope to someone who'd had it ripped away before? Josephine?" He reached across the table, covering her hand with his. "Whatever it is, we'll face it together. You know that." "I know." She took a deep breath. "Caleb, I'm going to have a baby." The words hung in the air between them. His hand tightened on hers, almost painfully, and she watched the color drain from his face. "You're certain?" "As certain as I can be. 2 months along, maybe a little more." He pulled his hand back, standing so abruptly his chair scraped against the floor. For a terrible moment, she thought he was going to walk out. Instead, he moved to the window, bracing his hands against the frame. "Caleb, please, say something." "Martha was pregnant when she died," he said, his voice rough. "Did I ever tell you that? 6 months along. We'd just felt the baby move for the first time the week before." Josephine's heart broke for him. She rose, moving to stand behind him, not quite touching. "I'm not Martha, and this isn't that time. I know that." He turned to face her, and she saw the war in his eyes, hope battling fear, love fighting the certainty of loss. But knowing and feeling are different things. "Then tell me what you feel." "Terrified," he admitted. "Terrified of losing you, terrified of failing another child, terrified of hoping for something and having it destroyed again." She took his face in her hands, forcing him to meet her eyes. "I'm scared too, but Caleb, we can't live our lives afraid of what might happen. This baby, our baby, deserves better than that." He covered her hands with his, closing his eyes. When he opened them again, she saw he'd made his choice. "You're right. Of course you're right." He pulled her against him, holding her tight. "A baby. We're going to have a baby. Are you happy?" she whispered against his chest. "I'm—" He pulled back to look at her, and she saw tears in his eyes. "Yes, God help me. Beneath all the fear, I'm happy. Is that wrong?" "No, my love, that's exactly right." They stood there holding each other until the stew grew cold, neither willing to break the moment. Finally, practicality won, and they sat down to their delayed supper, talking in hushed voices about the future. Another room for the cabin, a proper cradle, names they liked. As the weeks passed and Josephine's condition became obvious, the community's reaction was mixed. Some, like Reverend Hartley and his wife, were genuinely pleased, bringing gifts of baby clothes and blankets. Others whispered behind their hands about the hasty marriage and counted months on their fingers. "Let them count," Josephine said one Sunday after a particularly pointed snub from Mrs. Briggs. "They'll see soon enough that this baby was conceived in wedlock." But the hard work of the ranch didn't stop for morning sickness or swelling ankles. Josephine modified her duties as needed, but she refused to be treated like an invalid. She milked the cows until bending became too difficult, tended the garden on her knees when she could no longer stoop, and kept the household running with determined efficiency. Caleb watched her like a hawk, trying to take on more work to spare her, but she wouldn't have it. "I'm pregnant, not dying," she told him firmly one morning when he tried to stop her from collecting eggs. "Women have been doing this since Eve. I'll tell you when I need help." Still, she caught him watching her with that mixture of wonder and fear that had become familiar. Sometimes she'd wake in the night to find his hand spread protectively over her growing belly, as if he could shield their child from the world through will alone. One evening in late summer, as she struggled with the mending, her fingers had swollen. Making fine work difficult, she felt the first flutter of movement. She gasped, dropping the needle. "What is it?" Caleb was beside her in an instant. "Are you hurt? Is the baby—" "No, no." She grabbed his hand, pressing it to her belly. "Wait." They sat frozen for a long moment. And then it came again. A tiny flutter, like butterfly wings. His eyes went wide. "Was that our baby?" she confirmed, tears streaming down her face. "Our baby saying hello." He dropped to his knees beside her chair, both hands on her belly now, his forehead pressed against her. "Hello, little one," he whispered. "I'm your papa, and I promise I'll keep you safe. You and your mama both." As summer turned to autumn and Josephine grew heavy with child, they prepared as best they could. Caleb built a beautiful cradle from pine, sanding it until it was smooth as silk. Josephine sewed tiny clothes and blankets, each stitch a prayer for the future. The nearest doctor was a day's ride away, but they'd arranged for Mrs. Hartley to assist when the time came. She'd delivered dozens of babies over the years. They had clean linens, boiled water ready, all the preparations they could make. But as October arrived with its cold winds and early snow, Josephine couldn't shake a sense of foreboding. She was larger than seemed right for how far along she was, and the baby's movements had become almost frantic at times. "Something's not right," she told Caleb one night as they lay in bed. "I can feel it. Should I fetch the doctor?" "I don't know. Maybe I'm just being foolish. First-time mother nerves." But 3 nights later, she woke to pain and wetness. Too soon, she still had weeks to go. In the lamplight, she saw red staining the sheets and bit back a scream. Caleb, he was awake instantly, taking in the situation with one glance. "I'll get Mrs. Hartley. No, don't leave me, please. Josephine." Another wave of pain hit, stealing her breath. When it passed, she gripped his hand. "There's no time. The baby's coming now." The next hours blurred together in a haze of pain and fear. Caleb did his best, drawing on memories of helping with livestock births. But this was different. This was his wife, his child, and there was so much blood. Josephine fought with everything she had, but she could feel her strength ebbing. Between contractions, she touched Caleb's face. "If something happens, nothing's going to happen. Listen to me. If you have to choose, save the baby." "No." His voice was fierce. "I won't lose you, either of you." She wanted to argue, but another contraction stole her words. Time lost meaning. There was only pain in Caleb's voice, anchoring her to the world. And then, finally, impossibly, the sharp cry of a newborn. "It's a boy," Caleb said, his voice thick with tears. "Josephine, we have a son." She tried to answer, tried to reach for the baby, but darkness was creeping in at the edges of her vision. She heard Caleb calling her name, felt him press the infant against her chest, but everything was fading. "Stay with me," he begged. "Please, Josephine, don't leave me." She wanted to tell him she was trying, wanted to see their son properly, wanted so many things, but her body had given everything it had, and now it demanded payment. The last thing she heard was Caleb praying, the first time she'd heard him pray since they'd met, praying for God to take him instead, to spare her, to not let this story end in ashes like the last one. Then darkness claimed her, and she heard nothing at all. Josephine floated in a gray space between living and dying, aware of voices but unable to respond. She heard Caleb pleading with her, heard the baby crying. Heard someone else arrive. Mrs. Hartley, finally, her calm voice cutting through the chaos. Time meant nothing in that twilight place. She drifted, untethered, while somewhere far away people fought to pull her back to the world. When consciousness finally returned, it came slowly. First, the awareness of light beyond her closed eyelids, then sounds, a fire crackling, a baby's soft whimper, someone humming a lullaby. She tried to open her eyes and found it took enormous effort. "Josephine?" Caleb's voice, rough with exhaustion and hope. "Can you hear me?" She managed to turn her head slightly, and there he was, haggard, unshaven, looking like he'd aged 10 years. In his arms was a bundle of blankets from which tiny fists waved. "The baby," she whispered, her voice barely a sound. "He's perfect," Caleb said, tears streaming down his face. 10 fingers, 10 toes, and a voice that could wake the dead. "You've been unconscious for 2 days. We thought—" He couldn't finish. "Mrs." Hartley appeared beside him, checking Josephine's forehead. Her pulse. "The Lord was watching over you, child. You lost a lot of blood, but you're strong, stronger than you know. Can I hold him?" Caleb carefully transferred the baby to her arms, supporting them both when she proved too weak to manage alone. The infant was small but perfect, with a cap of dark hair and Caleb's serious mouth. His eyes, when they opened, were the same green as hers. "What shall we call him?" Caleb asked. Josephine studied their son's face, seeing hope and promise and all the dreams they'd almost lost. "Thomas," she said finally. "Thomas Matthew Morrison, after your father and mine." "Thomas," Caleb repeated, testing the name. "Tom Morrison. I like it." Recovery was slow and difficult. For weeks, Josephine could barely leave the bed, relying on Caleb and Mrs. Hartley for everything. The older woman stayed for a full month, teaching Caleb how to care for both wife and baby, cooking meals and keeping the household running. "You've got yourself a good man," she told Josephine one afternoon while Caleb was out tending the animals. "Not many would have kept their head like he did that night. He saved your life. Make no mistake." Josephine watched through the window as Caleb worked, little Thomas sleeping in a sling across her chest. "He saved mine long before that night." As she grew stronger, the rhythm of their new life emerged. Thomas was a good baby, alert and curious, only fussing when hungry or wet. Caleb took to fatherhood with a devotion that sometimes brought tears to Josephine's eyes. She'd catch him talking to Thomas as he worked, explaining about horses and weather and the proper way to mend a fence, as if the baby could understand every word. The community's attitude shifted with Thomas's arrival, even Mrs. Briggs couldn't maintain her hostility in the face of such an obviously happy family. People who'd whispered about the hasty marriage now brought gifts and congratulations. The baby had made them respectable in a way that time alone couldn't have managed. One evening in early December, as snow fell softly outside, they sat before the fire as had become their custom, Caleb in his chair with Thomas on his shoulder, Josephine in hers with her mending. The baby was nearly 2 months old now, growing round and healthy on his mother's milk and his parents' love. "I've been thinking," Caleb said suddenly, "about the spring. Thought maybe we could add that second room we talked about. Give Tom his own space when he's older. That would be wonderful. And maybe expand the garden too? I'd like to try growing more vegetables to sell in town. Whatever you want." He paused, studying her face in the firelight. "Are you happy, Josephine? Truly happy?" She set down her sewing, considering the question seriously. A year ago, she'd been running through a blizzard, certain she'd die alone and unloved. Now she sat in a warm home with a husband who cherished her and a baby who was the light of both their lives. "Happier than I ever dreamed possible," she said honestly. "And you?" He was quiet for a long moment. "Martha would have loved you," he said finally. "She always said I needed someone to challenge me, someone who wouldn't let me wallow. She'd have loved how you brought this place back to life, how you brought me back to life. I hope I've made her proud." Josephine said softly, "You have. We both have." He shifted Thomas to his other shoulder, the baby making soft sounds of contentment. I used to think God was punishing me, taking everything away. Now I think maybe he was preparing me for this, for you and Tom, teaching me that love isn't about holding on so tight you suffocate it, but about having faith even when you're scared. Spring came early that year, and with it, new life everywhere. The garden Josephine planted was ambitious. Rows of vegetables, herbs, even a small patch of flowers just for beauty. Caleb built the addition to the cabin while Thomas watched from a blanket spread in the shade, gurgling and reaching for the sawdust motes that danced in the sunlight. The ranch prospered. The cattle prices were good that year, and Josephine's preserved goods sold well in town. They paid off the mortgage and even had enough left to buy a new milk cow and some chickens. But more than material success, there was joy. Laughter rang through the cabin. Hope lived in every plan they made. On a warm Sunday in May, Reverend Hartley came to dinner after church. As they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the mountains gold, he smiled at the picture they made, Thomas toddling between his parents, Caleb catching him before he could tumble, Josephine laughing at their son's determined attempts to chase a butterfly. "You know," the Reverend said, "I've performed a lot of marriages in my time. Some for love, some for convenience, some because there was no other choice. But I've rarely seen one transform two people the way yours has. We've been blessed." Josephine agreed, scooping up Thomas before he could eat a handful of dirt. "Blessed, yes, but you've also worked for it, both of you. You took broken pieces and built something beautiful." He stood to leave, tipping his hat. That's a rare gift in this hard world. After he'd gone, Caleb and Josephine sat on the porch steps, Thomas drowsy in his mother's arms. The ranch spread before them in the gathering dusk, the sturdy cabin with its new addition, the thriving garden, the well-tended animals. But more than that, they saw a future, more children. God willing. Years of seasons turning, of challenges faced together, of love deepening with each passing day. "Do you remember?" Josephine said quietly. "That first night, when you found me in the snow. I'll never forget it. You saved my life." "No," Caleb corrected, pressing a kiss to her temple. "We saved each other," as if in agreement. Thomas yawned and snuggled deeper into his mother's embrace. Above them, the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, and somewhere in the distance, a wolf howled. Not threatening now, just part of the wild chorus that was their world. They went inside as full dark fell, Caleb barring the door against the night while Josephine settled Thomas in his cradle. Soon they'd move him to his own room, but for now, they kept him close. This miracle child who'd almost cost everything but had instead completed their family. That night, as every night, Caleb pulled Josephine close in their bed, her back against his chest, his hand resting protectively over her heart. They'd learned not to take such simple comforts for granted. Every day together was a gift, every moment of happiness hard-won. "I love you," he murmured against her hair. "And I love you," she replied, covering his hand with hers. Outside, the wind whispered through the pines, and the ranch settled into sleep. But inside, two hearts beat as one, and a baby breathed soft and even in his cradle. The mail-order bride who'd arrived in a blizzard had become the cornerstone of this home. The bitter widower who'd saved her had found redemption in loving again. Their story wasn't ending. It was just beginning. There would be more children, more challenges, more years of working side by side to build their dreams. But they would face it all together, bound by a love that had grown from the ashes of their separate griefs into something unbreakable. As sleep took them, Josephine smiled, thinking of that scared girl stumbling through the snow. She'd been looking for shelter from the storm. What she'd found was so much more. A home, a family, a love worth fighting for. And Caleb, holding his wife close, gave thanks for the blizzard that had brought her to his door. Sometimes the greatest blessings came disguised as the fiercest storms. In his cradle, Thomas stirred and sighed, dreaming baby dreams, and in the walls that sheltered them all, Love lived and breathed and promised tomorrow would be even better than today. Thank you all for joining us on this journey through the untamed frontier of the heart. If you're listening to this tale of love blooming in the harsh Wyoming winter, we'd love to know where in the world you're tuning in from. Drop a comment below and let's connect across the miles, just as Caleb and Josephine connected across their own vast differences. Don't forget to subscribe to Wild West Campfire for more stories of courage, redemption, and romance from the American frontier. Share your thoughts about Caleb and Josephine's journey. Did their love story touch your heart as much as it touched ours? Until we meet again around the campfire, partners, keep your hearts open to unexpected blessings, even when they arrive in the midst of life's fiercest storms.